A federal clean air law from 1990 did something nobody voted for. It made it a legal gray zone for your neighborhood mechanic to touch the computer that controls your truck's engine. Not the engine itself, the software. 90% of what's wrong with a modern diesel truck now lives inside a proprietary code. And for 2 decades, only one kind of shop was handed the key to read it. In a shop outside Canton, Ohio, a mechanic named Ray Dolinsky has been fixing trucks since 1994. He owns every wrench, every lift, every certification the job requires. And for years, he still had to tell customers to drive 90 minutes to a dealership for a 15-minute software fix he was legally barred from performing himself. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how an environmental law meant to clean the air ended up deciding who gets to fix your truck, and why that changed everything in 2026. That gray zone has a name, and it starts with the Clean Air Act's anti-tampering clause. We'll get to exactly what that clause says, and why manufacturers used it as a shield. Roughly 239,100 auto repair shops operate in the United States. 71% of them are independently owned, not dealerships, not franchises. That's over 169,700 small businesses. For those shops, emissions and DEF system repairs on modern trucks became a locked door. Ray's decision back in 2018 was to buy proprietary diagnostic access for one engine brand. The subscription cost him $1,800 a year. He could only afford one. Every truck that rolled in with a different engine brand still had to be turned away. That's a paying customer walking out the door every single time. The system behind this wasn't a single villain twisting a dial in Washington. It was layered: a 1990 anti-tampering statute, an OBD-II standardization rule from 1996 that only ever covered light vehicles, and manufacturers who controlled, legally, the proprietary software underneath their own emissions hardware. 3 different eras of regulation, stacked on top of each other, none of them built to talk to the others. 3 words: nobody planned this. But this is only the surface layer. And that gap between OBD-II's light vehicle rule and heavy-duty diesel software is exactly where the real cost gets buried. We're coming back to that number. Start with the intention. In 1990, Congress amended the Clean Air Act to stop people from disabling catalytic converters and emissions controls to make cars run better while polluting more. The anti-tampering clause was written to punish that. It worked. Tampering dropped. But the same clause created ambiguity manufacturers didn't have to resolve in anyone's favor but their own. If overriding an emissions system, even temporarily, even to diagnose a fault, could be read as tampering, why would a manufacturer volunteer the tools to make that override easy for a stranger's shop? They didn't answer. They delayed. Independent shops spent years requesting service data. Some manufacturers responded. Most offered partial access, on their own timeline, at their own price. A 2014 Industry Memorandum of Understanding was supposed to guarantee independents the same repair information dealers got, but government auditors later found it still left the hardest cases untouched. Advanced diagnostics, DEF system resets, proprietary software for the exact modules under the Clean Air Act's shadow. Cost became the second gate. Independent shops that wanted the software anyway found subscription fees running $500 to $2,000 a year per brand. A shop servicing 5 truck manufacturers needed 5 separate keys. 5 keys, 1 shop. Most owners could only ever justify buying one. Ray watched 3 of his longtime customers switch permanently to the dealership 20 minutes further out. Not because the dealer did better work, but because the dealer was the only legal option for that one truck's DEF system. He didn't lose those customers to bad service. He lost them to a paragraph in a 1990 statute nobody in that shop had ever read. The frustrating part wasn't the paperwork, it was the silence. Manufacturers weren't required to explain their pricing, weren't required to publish a timeline, and weren't required to justify why one engine brand's software cost triple another's. Independent shops were left guessing which subscriptions would actually pay for themselves before the next model year made the old software obsolete. Some shops adapted by specializing. One brand, one system, mastered completely, at the cost of turning away everyone else. Others simply stopped taking on diesel work altogether and shrank back to oil changes and brake jobs, the repairs no software gate could touch. That retreat had a name in the industry: de-skilling by regulation. Not because the mechanics forgot how engines worked, but because the law made it economically irrational to stay current on the part of the engine that mattered most. But here's what most people get wrong. Most people assume this was dealerships lobbying to keep repair work for themselves. That's not what the numbers show. The real economic driver was liability, not greed. Manufacturers faced Clean Air Act penalties if a temporary emissions override done by someone outside their control was later classified as illegal tampering. A single violation carries a civil penalty that is run as high as $45,268 per vehicle under EPA's Clean Air Act enforcement schedule. That's not a typo. Per vehicle. Multiply that by a fleet, and a manufacturer's caution stopped looking irrational. It started looking like the only defensible move available under an ambiguous law. So manufacturers didn't open the door. They built a toll booth instead, proprietary software, priced high enough to filter out casual access, sold as a solution that technically satisfied the law's letter while avoiding its risk. Here's the human scale version. A $1,800 annual software subscription is roughly what an independent shop earns from 12 to 18 standard diagnostic visits at market rate. An owner-operator running one truck breaks even on a comparable $1,500 tool investment only after 5 dealer visits avoided, a threshold that made sense for a fleet, and made no sense at all for a single pickup owner getting stranded twice a year. Independent shops, collectively, generate an estimated $115 billion a year in this country. That's larger than the GDP of most nations. And a meaningful share of that industry was structurally blocked from the highest margin, fastest-growing repair category on the road: emissions and DEF diagnostics on modern diesel trucks. That's the counterintuitive turn. This was never a story about mechanics losing a skill. It was a story about an entire tier of American small business, 169,700 plus shops, being priced and legally boxed out of the exact repair category that was growing the fastest, while carrying no fault of their own. And the dealer alternative wasn't cheap for the customer either. A diagnostic scan that costs $100 to $250 at an independent shop runs $200 to $500 or more at a dealership for the identical service, a gap of up to $400 that a truck owner paid, not because the work was harder, but because the law had quietly decided who was allowed to do it. That resolves the OBD-II coverage gap from Section 2. Heavy-duty diesel software was never folded into the 1996 standard, and that omission is what let manufacturers keep it proprietary for 30 years. If you've ever wondered why your regular mechanic suddenly said, "We can't touch that, you'll have to go to the dealer," you weren't imagining a decline in his skill. You were watching a federal statute make that decision for him, 30 years before you ever owned the truck. Most people assume repair costs go up because trucks get more complicated. That's half true. What almost nobody realizes is that complexity was compounded by a legal structure that made access to that complexity a paid, restricted privilege, even for a fully licensed ASE-certified shop 3 miles from your house. Knowing this puts you ahead of most truck owners in this country. You now understand that the price gap between your independent shop and the dealer wasn't a quality gap. It was a regulatory gap, one most drivers pay for their entire lives without ever learning why it exists. The 1990 anti-tampering clause from Section 1 finally resolves here. In July of 2026, the EPA issued formal guidance clarifying that temporary emissions overrides for the explicit purpose of repair are legal, closing the exact ambiguity manufacturers had used for 3 decades. Which brings us to what happens next. The guidance is issued. The legal ambiguity that shaped an entire industry for 30 years is, on paper, resolved. But guidance is not enforcement, and enforcement is not habit. Manufacturers built pricing models and software silos over 3 decades, and 3 decades of infrastructure doesn't dissolve because of a memo. Ray Dolinsky still owns 1 software subscription. He hasn't bought a second one yet. He's waiting to see whether reasonable terms from a federal guidance document turns into an actual invoice he can afford. Because in this industry, the law changes fast, but the price tag changes on its own schedule. The next time your check engine light comes on, the shop you choose may finally have a real choice too.